Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another webinar at the National Library of Scotland. My name is Kenny Redpath and I'm the Events Officer here at the library. I say, of course, welcome to the library, but of course it's a welcome to my sitting room, but you're all very, very welcome to be here today. And I have to say, I'm delighted that I see today's speaker just popped up. As of 13:52, our speaker's internet collapsed totally, so delighted. I'm delighted today to be introducing Fred Spence, who has been at the library for the last 3 months researching hospitals in our moving image archive. So it's an absolute delight that Fred is here to share their research and give us a talk called Hospitals and Healthcare, which is a kind of virtual visit to Scotland's hospitals via historic films from our collection at Moving Image Archive. Fred has almost finished their PhD in English Literature at the University of Glasgow. This Wellcome Trust funded research examines stigmatised health issues in contemporary Scottish literature and the press, 1997 to present, and the so-called Glasgow Effect, the phenomenon, you'd get that wrong, of poor health and high mortality in Scotland, even after accounting for socio-economic factors. But before handing over to Fred, can I just say that there will be time for questions at the end of the webinar. So get thinking and type your questions into the Q&A function, and we will do our very best to get through as many as we can. But for now, over to you, Fred.
Hi everyone, thank you. I'm in a total internet panic. My router's cut out. So I've connected to my phone, connected my laptop to my phone. I don't know how well it's going to play video. So this might go horribly wrong, but all the videos of the films are online on the Moving Image Archive website. So I'm hoping that you will go view them in full anyway. So I'm going to go try and share my screen and see what happens. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about hospitals and healthcare in the Moving Image Archive. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the context and purpose of each of the 3 films I'm going to be looking at, and that'll help, hopefully help give you a bit more sort of understanding about the films, and you'll get a bit more out of them. And I'll show some short clips as well if all goes to plan. So these are all available, as I say, for you to view online on the Moving Image Archive website. I want to start by looking at a film called Highland Doctor from 1943. It's a dramatised promotional film, so it uses a fictional story to explain and promote health services and policy changes. The film is set in the present day, so 1943, and we have a fictional doctor in the remote Scottish Highlands who calls a consultant for a second opinion on a case. They agree that the patient needs hospital care, so they arrange for an air ambulance, a plane, essentially, to fly the patient to Glasgow. And while they're waiting for the plane to arrive, the doctor and specialist discuss the provision of healthcare in the Highlands and Islands and some of the unique challenges faced in these remote areas. Through flashback, the Highland Doctor recounts what the situation was like before the Highlands and Islands Medical Service was established, and that was after the Dura Report in 1912. So this service provided a form of socialised healthcare to remoter parts of Scotland, and it's sometimes thought of a kind of precursor to the NHS, which wasn't established until 1948. So I will hopefully show you a clip from the film where the Highland Doctor explains some of these challenges of providing healthcare to this area pre-1912.
You haven't been long in the north.
3 years. I was in a London hospital when this vacancy turned up. You know, I'm an Edinburgh man, but even so, the Highlands and Islands medical scheme wasn't much more than a name to me.
Well, now that you've seen it working, what do you think of it?
Seems to me there's a great future for subsidized medical services like this one. take today. Mrs. MacDonald gets your services, a specialist, and an air ambulance to take her 200 miles to hospital. In fact, she's just as well off as a patient in town who has everything on her doorstep.
It was a different story when I came here first. I over 30 years ago. I used to look at that map and wonder if a way would ever be found to attract enough doctors to the Highlands and Islands to make it possible for the people there to get medical attention as easily and cheaply as the people in the south. It's a problem. A fifth of the land area of Scotland with so few people living in it. And those scattered like threepenny bits in a Christmas pudding. And with just a handful of doctors with our patients maybe miles away in isolated crofts and townships. It's often 30 miles to see one patient, a day's journey there and back. And they're poor too, farmers and fisher folk. You can't charge them what it costs you, they just haven't the money. But there is someone got to look after the folks in the Highlands and out here in the islands, even if it does mean a bit of a struggle. It's a problem.
So after this clip, we see the Highland Doctor giving evidence to the committee for the Dewar report. And then the film comes back out of flashback to the present day. And he explains to the specialist the way that things are better now with a socialised healthcare system. So here's another clip as he discusses that.
You haven't been
Sorry,
long in the
clip?
north.
3 years. By no means. It's interesting to hear it at first hand.
Well, when the grant had been definitely approved, the first job was to attract new doctors to the area. One of the first uses of the grant was to bring each doctor's income up to a level he could live on. In other words, he didn't have to depend on the people being able to pay him. And the people in turn only had to pay a small fee when they needed a doctor, instead of enough to cover his expenses. So the doctor was consulted more frequently. People's health improved and both doctors and patients benefited. We were able to afford cars under the new arrangement. And as the roads were improved, we could get round to our patients more easily. Now we could visit 3 patients in the time it used to take to see 1. Then the nursing associations got money from the grant to appoint more nurses, and well-qualified ones at that. After a while, many of them were provided with cars too. We began to have better telephone and telegraph services. New houses were built for us and for the nurses. The better roads made it possible to use ambulances more widely. And our key hospitals were enlarged to receive the patients we were now able to send them. They were equipped with up-to-date apparatus for all modern treatments, and resident specialists were appointed. Then, at the beginning of the war, the emergency medical service hospitals were organized to receive possible casualties. They meant extra accommodation, and they used some of their empty beds to take our patients off the waiting lists. And that brings us right up to date.
Why, man, you've jumped a couple of centuries in a few years.
From farm cart to air ambulance.
And it could never have happened if it hadn't been backed by the state.
So why was this film made? It's a great educational film if you want to learn about the Highlands and Islands Medical Service and see what some of these locations looked like. So the film was filmed on islands of Lewis, Harris and North Uist, Ullapool, Inverness and Dingwall. But beyond this, I think we can understand this film as essentially propaganda for state-run connected healthcare services, which were about to be launched on a much larger and even unprecedented scale with the NHS. The film was made by the Ministry of Information for the Department of Health for Scotland. It was made in 1943, so just 5 years before the launch of the NHS. And it was just the year before, in 1942, that the Beveridge Report was published. And that set out plans for the future of post-war Britain and laid foundations of what would become known as the welfare state. So this film is from a context where ideas about the state's role are changing, and ideas about the welfare state are starting to form. As the characters say, it seems to me there's a great future for subsidized medical services like this one. And it never could have happened if it wasn't backed by the state. The fairly abstract idea of state-sponsored connected healthcare is made concrete and relatable through the dramatization, which shows how this system means that a patient receives the care that they require. One of the successes of the Highlands and Islands Medical Service was the air ambulance, as we see in the film. The Scottish Air Ambulance Service connected remote islands and Highland communities with the medical resources of Scotland's southern cities. So in this next clip, we'll see the doctor sending for the air ambulance just after examining the patient.
By no means. You're right, she's pretty far advanced. But if we can get her to hospital at once, we've a pretty good chance.
Well, Stornoway is about 5 hours away by boat and road.
That would mean starting off along the road we came.
It would. What about the air ambulance? We can send her down to Glasgow.
Fine if it can be done.
Oh, yes, it can be done. It's been to the island before.
That's the thing. What about her husband?
Yes, if we're taking her to Glasgow, we must consult him. Nurse, where's MacDonald?
He isn't back yet from the fishing. He thought it'd be tomorrow you'd come. But he shouldn't be long now.
Let's make the arrangements anyway.
I can tell MacDonald when he comes in.
That's good, and I'll have a word with him later. We'd better be going down to the post office. We've got to wire Glasgow for the air ambulance, and we'll need to advise the hospital as well. Will you get your bag packed, nurse, and be ready to go?
When will you be back, Doctor?
It'll take about 2 hours for the plane to get here by the time we've sent off the wire. We should be back with the stretcher in about 2.5 hours.
About 5:30.
Very good, then.
The air ambulance became part of emergency medical care in many countries by the end of the 20th century. However, historian Ian Hutchison argues that Scotland was at the forefront of providing a public air ambulance service. There were some precedents. During World War I, planes were used to evacuate military personnel from battle zones, but not civilians. And the Flying Doctor service in Australia took medical aid to remote patients from 1928. In Scotland, however, patients were now flown from remote locations to urban medical care. And this began in 1933. A fisherman called John McDermott was at risk of peritonitis, inflammation of the abdomen lining, and moved from the Isle of Islay to Glasgow. Hutchison explains that nurses have been a feature of the air ambulance service since its beginning. John McDermott was accompanied by a Mrs. A.W. Ferguson, who was actually a nurse on holiday on the island at the time. But after traveling south with the patient, it was difficult for northern nurses to return, as there was no regular air service to take them back, and the journey could take several days. So from 1936, 2 nurses were contracted to accompany the outbound aircraft. They would fly from Glasgow to the patient and then accompany the patient on the trip south. The 2 nurses who did this first were Jean Govan and Peggy Boyd, and they did this until 1941, when wartime demands meant they were needed elsewhere. But the arrangements for nurses travelling north continued until 1993, when the Scottish Air Ambulance Service paramedics took over. The Scottish Air Ambulance Service is also significant because it was part publicly funded several years before the NHS, at a time when patients were expected to pay for their own medical care. When it began, the patient was responsible for flight costs. From 1934, some financial aid was available from the Department of Health for Scotland, although patients would still be expected to make some contribution. The service became totally free under the NHS in 1948. The stories about the air ambulance were often covered in the press because these were really exciting news stories. An early article in the Scotsman in 1934 reports that Arthur Alexander had a severe eye injury after being hit by a golf ball and was motored from Colonsay to Islay and then flown to Glasgow. A 1937 article describes the heroic pilot making a perfect landing in darkness in poor conditions, guided only by flares. The Times in 1952 celebrated 2,500 patients transported in 19 years of service. The youngest patient was a premature baby weighing 3 pounds. The oldest was almost 90. A baby was even born in the aircraft above the airport. So, here's one last clip from Highland Doctor, as the patient is taken by air ambulance to Glasgow. You'll see the patient on a stretcher and also a nurse get on the plane, a woman dressed in black. The clip ends with the Highland Doctor, the consultant, and the patient's husband watching the plane leave, as if proudly looking off into the future. And note the swelling, triumphant music. So the second film I want to discuss is It Began on the Clyde, and that was made in 1946 by the Ministry of Information for the Department of Health for Scotland, again. This is another dramatised promotional film. We see David, a war worker suffering from unexplained fatigue and pain. When he's not at his demanding job, he's dealing with the usual domestic stresses at home with children. He can't get a proper rest. His GP can't identify anything particularly wrong with him and can only suggest trying to relax and avoiding snacks, but he's still unwell. Like the previous film, It Began on the Clyde uses a dramatised story to celebrate the achievements of a past health scheme. This time it's the Clyde Basin scheme, which launched in 1942. This was a unique experiment in preventative medicine, again before the NHS made healthcare freely available to everyone. War workers who were stressed and fatigued could get thoroughly tested and rested in hospital. And again, I think the purpose of this film is to promote socialised and preventative medicine generally in the years leading up to the NHS. Extra hospital beds had become available because at the outbreak of World War II in 1939, the government had built extra hospitals in the countryside to deal with expected civilian air raid casualties. But there was a lot less casualties than expected, and that meant free hospital beds. So the beds went to other civilians who needed it, exhausted and overworked war workers and those on hospital waiting lists. As the film shows, treating the war workers early on meant they could actually recover faster and then return to work. I'm going to let the clips do most of the talking with this one as they elaborate really nicely on the scheme. So first, let's hear more about how the scheme worked with this clip from the film.
Dr. Caskie, with all his skill, needed help to overcome these difficulties. Now here was a place where something really worthwhile could be done for David. What he and many hundreds of young Scottish war workers needed was a really thorough examination. Scientific tests to find what lay behind their aches and pains. And just at that time, all these facilities were available in Scotland. Not in the ordinary hospitals, but in the emergency medical service hospitals out in the open country. Now, 7 of these special hospitals had been built by the Department of Health for Scotland to take war casualties. But up to 1941, war injured had been fewer than expected. And so, in every EMS hospital, beds and nursing staff were ready for more cases. The Department of Health decided to try an experiment. The medical officers held meetings with general practitioners.
The point is, our emergency medical service hospitals are not yet full to capacity. Yet every one of you is rushed off his feet. It doesn't make sense. So the Department of Health is initiating an experiment. We want to use the vacant bed space for the early investigation of ill health. I know you're doing all you can, but you must all have some cases of the kind that we should be able to help you with.
Does that mean TB?
I know TB is one of our special difficulties, but it's one for sanatoria rather than the EMS hospitals at the moment. Besides, as you are all aware, there is already a serious shortage of nurses for the tuberculosis hospitals. No, the people we have in mind are the ordinary medical and surgical patients. People who are not ill enough to get immediate admission to a hospital. People who cannot afford a specialist, and yet who need specialist investigation. With your cooperation, we believe we can help both you and them by getting admission to the EMS hospitals. And if need be, arranging for a period of aftercare in one of the convalescent hospitals. It is of the utmost importance for the war effort just now that everyone should be as fit for work as possible. But there is more in it than the war effort.
Aye, but we just haven't got the time to go through our cards for the right cases and then fill up form after form.
Oh, but you don't have to go through your cards. The next time one of your patients comes back to you, just you say,
And now then, David, you're not getting on too well. But there's a new scheme which I think might be the very thing for you. Now, I want you to go along to Renfrew Street, Glasgow, and see the regional medical officer for a special overhaul. Will you go?
Right.
Fine. Then I'll write him a note. Now, today is Monday. I expect he'll see you Friday or maybe before. Oh, by the way, he'll pay your travelling expenses.
That's fine.
So in the next clip, we're going to see some of the life in the hospital, the treatment David receives, and his recovery.
But soon David is on his way to the EMS hospital at Ballochmyle. This scheme, known at first as the Clyde Basin experiment, was a new attempt to solve the medical problem of today, the problem of checking disease in the early stages, simply carrying out what we all learned in the nursery about prevention being better than cure. If this scheme worked well, it would be a big advance in social medicine.
Davy Black went to the hospital today. Some folks know how to pull the strings, eh? Well, I don't know. Diet again.
To Jock McCall, this is just another social injustice. But though he doesn't know it yet, he too will soon be at Ballochmyle. David now gets regular meals, and he can relax completely because everything's being done for him. He's been to the X-ray room and undergone a routine check. And the laboratories too are at work to find out what they can about the cause of his tiredness. But David, comfortably in bed, is hardly aware of all that's being done to find out what his trouble is. And in fact, the hospital finds that David Black has not developed any serious trouble. He's just thoroughly run down. And the pain in his back is a legacy from a wrench he gave his muscles months ago in the yard. So he can get up at once. But he needs specially designed exercises to get the muscles of his back working again properly. This treatment is at hand in the physiotherapy department. Day by day, David's condition improved, and in between hospital routine, he was able to wander in the grounds and relax. Sunshine and complete change of scene gave new hope to a man. David felt this, and he was cheered up by a meeting he had on his first day out.
Thank you, nurse. I've been wanting to see you. I'm the welfare officer here, and the doctor tells me you've been worried about your sickness benefit and...
As a matter of routine, the welfare officer gets to know each patient and helps to smooth out social and domestic problems.
They do you well here, don't they?
So in this final clip from the film, we'll hear more about the afterlife of the scheme and the return to work.
Jock's cure was now beginning. He and thousands like him were enabled to get the treatment they needed fairly quickly. For about this time, the voluntary hospitals were given power to nominate patients from their waiting lists for early admission to emergency hospitals like Ballochmyle. The Department of Health launched an attack on the waiting lists, and altogether 37,000 Scottish civilians were taken from the hospital queues in the towns for treatment in the quiet of the country. David, whose ailment was caught in time before he became a chronic case, could have been sent on to a convalescent home, but after 3 weeks he was fully recovered.
Well, David, you're looking a different man. How do you feel?
I'm feeling great and ready for work, but the hospital folks said that you would have to send me off first.
I can do that now with a clear conscience. I've had a copy of the report from the hospital. They made a fine job of you.
David, back at his work, was up that the Clyde Basin experiment had supplied a new link in the medical service. In its first year, the scheme took care of 1,400 young workers who might otherwise have been seriously ill through overstrain. The scheme, now called the Supplementary Medical Service, or SMS, was then extended from young workers in the Clyde area to workers of all ages all over Scotland. So that in the last 4 years, more than 10,000 patients have been to see the regional medical officer.
Keeping men and women working full tilt on their ward jobs was the reason for our plans coming into existence. Ballochmyle and 6 other hospitals were set up for the emergency medical service, but they have been built to last longer than the war emergency. What we have done for war workers in Scotland must be continued and extended until no one need be without the best medical and surgical care as soon as he or she needs it.
So on to our last film. The previous two have focused on healthcare services available to patients. I want to end by thinking a bit more about healthcare professionals themselves. Our final film is called The Caring Profession. It's a nursing recruitment film made in 1971 by the Scottish Home and Health Department. I think it's interesting because we get to see how the film wants to make nursing attractive. The film is also notable because it is presented by actor Andrew Cruikshank. He played the fictional Dr. Cameron in popular television drama Dr. Finlay's Casebook, which ran on the BBC for 8 seasons between 1962 and 1971 before moving to radio. So he's already a well-known face and associated with the medical profession. I don't know what the budget was for this film, but hiring a TV actor makes me think that the film is kind of a big deal for the Scottish Home and Health Department. So why might a recruitment film be made? Newspapers from around this time report on nursing shortages. I also looked at some yearly reports on health and welfare services in Scotland by the Scottish Home and Health Department. The reports from around this time reveal several promotional strategies in nursing recruitment. A report from 1966, so about 5 years before this film, outlines a national publicity campaign to improve the image of nursing by correcting out-of-date ideas. The campaign targeted teen magazines It used the slogan, "Surely the most rewarding job in the world." So look out for that slogan in this first clip from the opening of the film. Think about what mood the music sets and notice what tasks the nurses are doing and what they're not doing as well that you might expect to see. Does this seem like an appealing job?
Anyone who chooses to train as a nurse today is a fortunate person, for they do a job that has real meaning and purpose. Their value to society makes such a claim. There are few careers for young people which equal nursing in the intensely satisfying experience of using knowledge and skill to bring health, comfort, and happiness to others. Nursing. Surely the most rewarding job in the world. The caring profession.
I think that clip is really interesting because on one hand, we do see nurses doing a variety of tasks, such as changing the dressing on a wound. But a lot of what we see is also like fluffing up pillows, and the music makes it seem like it's a very leisurely job. The hospital setting is clean and bright and the patients are all happy and friendly. There doesn't seem to be much illness, pain, anxiety or stress. So what out-of-date ideas did these publicity campaigns want to address? I think this relates to status and conditions. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, student nurses were kept under strict rules. They were required to live on site in their hospitals, nursing homes. Their movements, conduct, manners, and morals were under the matron's scrutiny. If they didn't meet the required standards, if they were caught smoking or didn't return to bed by a set time, for example, they could be sanctioned and eventually sometimes asked to resign. Students were also expected to work long hours and weren't allowed much of a social life. This began changing in the mid-20th century as these rules were considerably loosened, and we can see this in our film. You'll notice in some of the upcoming clips that there's an emphasis on freedom, friendships, and fun. There's also been a long ongoing debate, and I think it maybe still continues. Are student nurses mainly students or mainly nurses? How much of their training should be in classrooms or on wards? And this is to do with status and pay again. A junior employee might get paid more than a student, but be expected to take on different responsibilities maybe earlier. So student nurses could often end up being used as a form of cheap labor. By the time of our film, full degrees in nursing were just starting to be introduced. Nursing had increasingly become viewed as a skilled profession. So with all this in mind, let's see what student life is like in this next clip.
It's not a solitary or lonely profession. Even off duty at the end of the day, or before going on duty at the start of the evening, there's a chance to talk things over, compare notes, discuss our various patients. Because all the time, we're involved with people. I had my own room and soon made plenty of friends from the moment I started training.
Not many of you will have an opportunity of working in an ophthalmic ward during your training. But there is one eye disorder which you will all see in outpatient clinics, in the general ward.
It all seems so very vast when you first start. Principles and practice of nursing, medical and surgical treatment, anatomy and physiology, and the nature and causes of diseases.
The white of the eye. Where only one eye is is affected, the cause is generally a foreign body. A piece of dust or grit, or even an eyelash.
But you soon sort yourself out. And of course, we train on the job. Nursing is something that is happening all the time. You never really finish. But as you get on through your training, everything falls into place.
So the Scottish Home and Health Department report from 1967 also emphasises the recruitment of men into nursing. It explains that there had been over 300 inquiries from men home and overseas that year. Our film includes a section on men in nursing with psychiatric nurse John. As the presenter Andrew Cruikshank says, "Oh yes, John's a nurse too. In this modern complex world of medicine, the opportunities for men in nursing have never been greater." And that might be true, but opportunities for men in nursing were still quite limited. A 1969 Guardian article explains that men were rarely allowed to practice obstetric or gynecological nursing. And while there were 9,200 male nurses in general hospitals, there were 18,700 male psychiatric nurses. So they were really overrepresented in one type of nursing. So I don't think it's incidental that the man in nursing here is a psychiatric nurse. I want to play a clip that describes mental health nursing and highlights some of the attitudes in it. So if we think about asylum treatment of the 19th century, this was focused on containment, restraint, and isolation. Individuals admitted to asylums often did not leave, were not even allowed to leave the grounds, or stayed for many, many years, kept isolated from the larger community. A big change in the way individuals and institutions were understood came in 1930 with the Mental Treatment Act. It amended the Lunacy Act 1890. While the Lunacy Act referred to those in asylums as lunatics, the Mental Treatment Act referred to them for the first time as patients, and the asylum was now a hospital. The terminology resembled that of physical illness, so mental health was beginning to be viewed as equal to physical health. Before 1930, lunatics admitted to an asylum were certified, which required a magistrate, and their symptoms had to be severe enough to meet criteria for certification. There was no option for self-discharge. After 1930, patients could go to hospitals voluntarily and temporarily. They could be admitted with milder symptoms, so we have more of a focus on preventing crisis. And a voluntary patient could discharge themselves with 72 hours notice in writing. And this 72 hours gave the hospital time to contact the patient's family by letter and to plan their ongoing support outside of hospital. So we have a move to shorter hospital stays and ideas of staying connected to or integrating back into the community. So here's a clip giving an overview of mental health nursing. We see an emphasis on communication and community, and mental distress is framed here as an illness, not a moral failing or a permanent defect, as maybe it had been earlier. As with the earlier clip, I invite you to think about the mood the music sets and what seems to be included in the job and what perhaps is missing.
There's so much mental distress caused by the tensions within our society, it's obvious that we must have nurses in order to give emotional support. It's not a glamorous side of nursing, not like heart transplants, but it is important. We now know that if a person is made sick by society, they must be cured within society. So the nurse acts as a bridge between the doctor, the social worker, and the family. John here can tell us something about this. He is one of a number of men in Scotland in professional nursing who's taking a post-registration course in psychiatric nursing.
Psychiatric nursing is very different from general nursing in respect that you're not dealing so much with the physical needs of the patient, as you do find in general nursing, but more of the mental needs of the patient.
Mental needs and emotional needs. This is something which is very complex. The working of the mind is something which we're only just beginning to understand.
As more and more people begin to find the pressures and strains of modern life too much for them, I think this is very important work indeed. And though it makes more demands upon you than general nursing, it's exciting too, because a mentally sick person is only suffering from an illness, and this can quite often be cured. Every single one of my patients is truly an individual case. They have particular difficulties in communicating with others and adjusting to the situation. For the time being, they're unable to cope with everyday life. I have to get through to them, become the bridge, the channel, if you like, through which they can come back to us. Understanding, patience, and kindness are what are needed above all. Just a simple business of giving essential drugs and medicines can be made to be a pleasant and personal experience. Nowadays, we know that the environment in which we set out to cure mental illness is in itself a very important part of the cure. In psychiatric nursing, we're dealing very much with the social needs of the patient, too. We hear a lot these days about communication. What I have to do is to achieve a genuine and lasting communication with all my patients. Make them feel useful and needed again. And then they'll be well on the way to recovery. Coming back to us in the real world as it is. The world in which we all have to work and live in together. The length of time a patient is in a psychiatric hospital is nearly always much longer than in the case in a general hospital. The whole nature of the cure, of my work, is getting to know the patients, and this takes time. You find yourself becoming very involved with the patients and with their families as well.
So would this film convince you to become a nurse? The film, as part of a larger promotional campaign, seems to have been considered a success by the Scottish Home and Health Department. A 1971 report claims that there had been an increase in staff and student numbers, reflecting substantially improved recruitment during the year and reversing a downward trend that had persisted for several years. Requests about nursing training, especially by individuals overseas, had risen from 3,000 the previous year to 5,700. So to finish, I'd just like to encourage you all to watch these films in full on the Moving Image Archive website. There's lots of really great material there on so many topics, some of it quite fun and surprising, so it's well worth exploring. And thank you for letting me share just these 3 films today. Thank you.